4:12 p.m., a private aircraft hangar on the outskirts of a silent city. Inside, a cutting-edge business jet sits paralyzed. The upgrade project is a disaster. Engineers are whispering in fear. Claire Bennett, the famously ruthless CEO, has no time for excuses. She turns to a 42-year-old man in grease-stained overalls standing near the cockpit. He is David Keller, a simple technician and a single father. Claire looks him in the eye and snaps, "Fly it, or get fired." The hangar goes deathly quiet. David looks at the control panel. He speaks one sentence, and everything changes. Watch the man closely. Today, he knows gravity. David Keller was a man of steel and silence. At 42, his face was a living map of high-altitude experience, etched with the subtle lines of a man who had spent his youth chasing horizons and his middle age protecting them. He wasn't a corporate climber. He didn't wear tailored suits or carry a high-status title that granted him access to the executive lounges. He was a systems maintenance technician at Bennett Aviation, responsible for the delicate wiring, hydraulic seals, and sensor calibration of the world's most expensive private jets. The hangar was his cathedral. It smelled of industrial floor wax, aerosolized lubricant, and the sharp ozone scent of high-voltage electronics. In the high-pressure world of aerospace engineering, David was a ghost. He arrived at the hangar exactly 30 minutes before his shift, checked every bolt twice, and left quietly when the job was done. To the senior engineers, he was just the guy with the wrench. They saw the black oil under his fingernails and the faded blue of his uniform, but they never bothered to look into his eyes. Eyes that had stared down storms that would make their flight simulations crash. But David's life was far more complex than the engines he serviced. He was a single father to 10-year-old Emma. 3 years ago, his world had been hollowed out when his wife Sarah passed away after a long, brave battle with illness. In the aftermath of that loss, David had systematically dismantled his old high-octane life. He had walked away from a career that kept him in the clouds, often for weeks at a time, to ensure he could be the one waiting on the ground for Emma. He chose the technician role because it was stable, predictable, and allowed him to be home for dinner every night. He didn't need the adrenaline of flight anymore. He needed the sanctuary of fatherhood. He had traded the pilot's yoke for a lunchbox and a set of Allen keys. However, Bennett Aviation was currently in the middle of a terminal crisis. They were upgrading the Skystream G5, a business jet designed to be the fastest and most fuel-efficient in its class. But the project was hemorrhaging money. In the last 3 flight tests, the automated control system had responded erratically during high-speed transitions. The company's primary test pilots, men with thousands of hours in the cockpit, had begun to refuse to take the G5 up. They cited a phantom oscillation, a rhythmic shaking that felt like the plane was trying to tear itself apart, yet it never showed up on the diagnostic computers. The atmosphere in the hangar was thick with professional panic. Claire Bennett, the 35-year-old CEO, was under immense pressure from a billionaire client who was waiting for delivery. She stood in the center of the hangar, her reflection sharp against the polished aluminum of the jet's fuselage. She was a woman who defined herself by cold, hard results. And right now, she was staring at a $300 million failure that threatened her father's legacy. David sat on a rolling stool near the landing gear, his tablet open to the raw flight logs. He heard the lead engineer blaming the AI software. He heard the CTO blaming the manufacturing of the pitot tubes. He heard everyone fighting for their own survival, terrified of the woman standing at the head of the team. They were all looking at the big picture, but David was looking at the vibrations. Emma had sent him a text earlier that day. "Dad, don't forget to check the wings. I want you home for movie night. We're watching the one with the space robots." David looked at the message, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, and then he looked back at the jet. He saw something in the hex code of the data logs that the experts had missed, a small rhythmic lag that felt hauntingly familiar. As the shouting reached a crescendo, Claire Bennett turned to the crew. Her patience had finally evaporated. She needed a scapegoat, or she needed a miracle. Her eyes landed on David, who was staring at the avionics panel with a calm, detached intensity. To her, he looked like he was daydreaming. Her frustration boiled over into a sharp, mocking ultimatum that echoed off the metal rafters. Claire Bennett was a force of nature. She didn't believe in variables. She believed in execution. She marched toward the cockpit where David was standing, her heels clicking like gunshots on the concrete floor. "You've been staring at that panel for 3 hours, David," she began, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I've heard the engineers talk about code. I've heard the pilots talk about feelings. But I'm seeing a grounded aircraft in a late contract. You're the one who signed off on the sensor integration for the tail assembly. If you're so confident in this machine, if you're standing here doing nothing while we fail, then prove it." She leaned in, her gaze locking onto his with a clinical coldness. "Our primary test pilot is refusing to board. He says the stick feels mushy and the airframe is haunted. I have a deadline at sunset. Fly it, David, or get fired. I don't have room for technicians who just watch things break. I need a team that makes them fly. Do you understand?" The hangar went deathly silent. Several engineers looked away, embarrassed by the sheer weight of the threat. They expected David to scramble. They expected him to explain that he wasn't a pilot, or to beg for more time to run another series of simulations. They expected him to break. But David Keller didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He stood there with a posture that wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't defeated either. He looked at Claire, and for a second she saw something she didn't expect, a calm, analytical pity. It was the look a seasoned captain gives to a first-year cadet who has lost their bearings in a storm. "I understand the deadline, Claire," David said, his voice steady and remarkably clear. "But before I even think about stepping into that cockpit, can I ask the room one question? Just one." Claire crossed her arms, her jaw set. "Make it quick. You're on the clock." David turned toward the lead software engineer, pointing not at the lines of code, but at the secondary trim actuators on the schematic projected on the wall. "Has anyone checked the trim calibration during the autopilot transition? Specifically at Mach 0.8, while the pitch yaw damping is engaged?" The lead engineer scoffed, adjusting his glasses and sighing with a dramatic flair. "David, we've run the trim diagnostics 10 times. The servos are within 1% of the target. It's a software logic error in the flight envelope protection, not a mechanical trim issue. We need to rewrite the kernel, which will take weeks." "No," David countered, his voice gaining a resonant, unbreakable strength that filled the echoes of the hangar. "The servos are fine. The software is fine. But the timing of the handover is off. When the system switches from manual pitch control to autopilot, it's assuming the air is static. But at that speed, the air is heavy. It's like liquid. We aren't measuring the force of the wind. We're measuring the intent of the pilot. We are measuring the wrong thing. And because of that, the system is fighting its own correction. It's not a bug. It's a misunderstanding of physics." He looked at Claire, who was now leaning back against the fuselage, her eyes narrowing as she processed the change in his energy. The guy with the wrench was gone. In his place was someone who sounded like he had seen 1,000 missions and knew exactly how the air felt against a wing at 30,000 feet. "You told me to fly it," David said quietly. "I will, but I'm not going to fly a machine that hasn't been told the truth about the wind. Give me 20 minutes to adjust the trim offset by 0.5 degrees. If I'm wrong, you can have my badge and my toolkit before I even hit the ground. But if I'm right, we meet our deadline." For the first time in her career, Claire Bennett didn't have a rebuttal. She watched David as he climbed into the cockpit and began to pull up the raw calibration logs. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicked. He was working with the precision of a surgeon who had already found the tumor. The hangar felt different. The nobody had just become the only person in the building who wasn't afraid of the machine. The silence in the hangar stretched for what felt like hours as David's fingers flew across the avionics touchscreen. He wasn't just checking numbers. He was listening to the heartbeat of the G5. Claire Bennett stood at the base of the boarding stairs, her curiosity finally winning over her irritation. She signaled for the security team to hold their positions. "Where did you learn to read a trim transition like that, David?" Claire asked, her voice dropping into a whisper. "That's not in the technician's manual. That's an advanced aeronautical insight that usually takes a master's in aerodynamics to understand. David didn't look away from the screen. His hands were steady. I've seen it happen at 40,000 feet over the Pacific. When the sky turns black and the computer thinks it knows more than the wings, that 0.5-degree difference is the only thing that keeps you from a flat spin and a grave in the ocean. The room went cold. The chief engineer, an older man named Harrison, who had been with the company since Claire's father started it, stepped forward. His eyes were wide with a sudden, jolting realization. Flight testing 10 years ago, the Astra project, the lead test pilot who saved the prototype after a double-engine flameout at night, his name was Keller, David Keller. David sighed, the weight of the memory finally visible in the slump of his shoulders. I didn't save the prototype, Harrison. I just listened to what it was trying to tell me. People think flying is about control. It's not. It's about cooperation with gravity. The boardroom-level directors who had been watching from the balcony were stunned. They were sitting in the same hangar as a legendary test pilot, a man most people in the aviation industry assumed had retired to a private ranch or disappeared into government contracting after the Astra project ended. Why? Claire asked, walking up the stairs to stand at the cockpit door. She looked at his grease-stained overalls and then at his calm, focused face. You were the best in the world. You were a hero. You could have run any flight department on the planet. Why are you sitting in a hangar in the suburbs, checking my sensor logs for a technician's wage? Because 10 years ago, I was a hero to the newspapers and a complete stranger to my wife, David replied, his voice devoid of pride or bitterness. I spent my 30s in cockpits, arguing about pitch rates and fuel burn curves with engineers who never left the ground. I was in a test flight over the Mojave when Sarah received her first diagnosis. I was at a debrief in London when she went into her second surgery. I was a legend in the sky, Claire, but I was a ghost at home. I wasn't there when the people who loved me needed me to land. The air in the cockpit seemed to thin. Claire, who had spent her entire adult life chasing the very pinnacle David had walked away from, felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability. She saw her own life reflected in his story. The missed dinners, the broken relationships, the endless pursuit of a number on a chart. When Sarah got truly sick, David continued, his eyes reflecting the blue glow of the instrument panel, I realized that a $300 million jet doesn't have a soul. It doesn't care if you're there at night. It doesn't miss you when you're gone. I resigned the day she went into hospice. I walked away from the flight hours, the adrenaline, and the legacy because they were weightless. I took this job because I promised Emma I would never be a ghost in her life again. I didn't hide my past because I was ashamed of it, Claire. I hid it because I was finished with it. I chose the movie night over the Mach speed. He looked at his watch. 4:45 p.m. I told Emma I'd be home by 6. The calibration is done. The oscillation won't return because the computer finally knows the air is there. Claire looked at the nobody in the technician's shirt. She saw the scars of a life lived at the same breakneck speed she was currently traveling. She realized that she had been mocking a man who had already conquered the mountain she was still desperately and lonely climbing. You solved a problem that my best pilots and engineers couldn't touch for 6 months, Claire said softly. You saved this project today. You saved my career. I can't just let you go back to checking bolts, David. It's a crime against the industry. I'm not looking for a promotion, Claire, David said, stepping out of the cockpit and grabbing his toolkit with a finality that closed the argument. I'm looking for the 5:15 bus. I've already lived the life where the mission came first. I don't want it back. The view from 30,000 feet is beautiful, but it's very cold up there. Claire walked him to the hangar door, ignoring the confused stares of her board. She didn't offer him a vice presidency. She didn't offer him a massive signing bonus. She knew he wouldn't care. Instead, she offered him the only thing he actually valued. I want you to be our chief safety architect, she said, her tone firm but respectful. 30 hours a week, full flexibility. You oversee the transitions and the handovers from the ground. You only go up when you choose to. Your salary will be triple what you're making now, but your schedule belongs entirely to your daughter. I don't want your soul, David. I just want your eyes on our blind spots. And maybe Maybe you can teach me how to land too." David paused at the threshold of the hangar. He looked at Claire, really looked at her, and saw the woman behind the CEO mask. He saw the quiet loneliness that often comes with the view from the top. "I'll do it," David said, "but on one condition. You have to start leaving this hangar by 6 p.m. at least twice a week." "You're too young to be this cold, Claire. The sky is beautiful, but the earth is where the people are. Don't wait until the engine flames out to realize that." As David walked toward the bus stop, Claire stood in the doorway of her empire. She realized that she hadn't just saved a project today. She had found a mentor who knew the true price of the clouds, and for the first time in years, she looked forward to the sunset. The transition wasn't immediate, but it was profound. The next morning, the company's lead test pilot, a man named Jack, who had previously refused to fly the G5 after a terrifying near stall, returned to the hangar. He looked skeptical when he heard that a maintenance guy had fixed the logic. Jack walked into the cockpit and saw the new calibration notes. He recognized the handwriting. Precise, slightly slanted, the marks of a man who dealt in certainties. He recognized the logic of the 0.5-degree offset. He turned to Claire, who was standing on the floor below, her eyes dark from a lack of sleep but bright with anticipation. "Who touched the trim offset, Claire? This is sophisticated." "The new chief architect," Claire replied. Jack took the jet up. The entire engineering team stood on the tarmac, their necks craned toward the blue sky, staring at the telemetry screens. As the G5 reached Mach 0.8, the exact moment where the oscillation usually began, the room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the cooling fans. The lines on the graph stayed flat. The system was perfectly stable. "It's like butter," Jack's voice crackled over the radio, sounding relieved and excited. "The transition is seamless. The phantom is gone. How did he find it? It was only a half-degree shift." "He listened to the wind," Claire whispered to herself. Over the next few weeks, David Keller, now the chief safety architect, began to change the culture of Bennett Aviation. He didn't demand 80-hour weeks. He didn't celebrate the hustle of sleeping in the office. Instead, he forced the design engineers to spend 4 hours a week in the hangar, talking to the maintenance crews and getting their hands dirty. He taught them that the most important data isn't found in a simulation. It's found in the grease and the grit of the real world. He was teaching them the Sarah lesson, that you can't build a machine that ignores the human element, because eventually a human has to trust it with their life. One afternoon, Claire took a car out to the outskirts of the city. She wanted to see the man who had changed her company without ever raising his voice. She found David in a small park, helping Emma fly a complex, multi-stage kite he had built from carbon fiber scraps. It was the complete opposite of the corporate hangar. There was no polished aluminum, no cold pressure, no billionaire clients, just wind, string, and the sound of a child's laughter. "You really did walk away, didn't you?" Claire asked, sitting on a wooden park bench next to him. "I didn't walk away, Claire," David corrected her, ruffling Emma's hair as the kite dipped and surged. "I walked toward something. Most people in our world think that success is a line on a chart that goes up forever. But success is actually a landing. It's about how smoothly you can bring yourself back to the people who are waiting for you at the gate." Emma showed Claire her sketchbook. It wasn't filled with typical drawings of princesses or cartoons. It was filled with intricate maps of flight paths and sketches of birds with labels for their primary feathers. "She has your eyes," Claire noted, looking at the depth of the girl's gaze. "She has her mother's heart," David said softly, "and that's why she's a better pilot than I ever was. She knows that every bird on a map isn't a target. It's just a soul looking for a place to rest." Claire realized that David hadn't just solved her jet project. He had exposed the flaw in her own life. He had shown her that the all-in mentality she prided herself on was actually a form of poverty. She was rich in stock, but bankrupt in connection. She had a legacy of planes, but no legacy of people. As she took the car back to the city that night, Claire looked at the glowing skyline. She didn't see it as a series of targets anymore. She saw it as a collection of landings. Millions of homes, millions of dinners, and millions of people trying to find their way back to what mattered. She decided that from now on, she would be the CEO who knew when to land. The contract she had signed with David wasn't just a professional agreement. It was a human one. She had hired him to watch her blind spots, but he had ended up showing her the light. 3 months later, the full rollout of the Skystream G5 was complete. It was hailed by Aviation Week as the most stable and reliable business jet ever designed. The company's reputation had reached an all-time high, but more importantly, the internal turnover rate among the staff had dropped by 40%. The Keller protocol, focusing on human-centric calibration and strict work-life boundaries, had become the new industry standard. David Keller was still the chief safety architect. He still worked from the hangar. He still wore simple shirts and carried a dented toolkit that had been with him through 3 continents. He never made the headlines, and he never asked for a corner office. He remained the man in the shadows, but now the shadows were filled with respect instead of invisibility. One evening, Claire and David were walking toward the employee parking lot after a brief, successful board meeting. The sun was setting behind the city, painting the hangar doors in shades of liquid gold and deep amber. "The board wants to know your secret, David," Claire said, looking at the hangar she now ran with a much lighter, more confident hand. "They want to know how you solved the oscillation in one afternoon when 10 of the highest-paid directors in Europe couldn't fix it in a year." David smiled, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the horizon. "There is no secret, Claire. Most people fail in engineering because they think they're the only ones with a problem to solve. They forget that the machine is just a bridge between 2 people. If you give the people a reason to trust the bridge won't shake. It's about honesty between the pilot, the engineer, and the machine." "And what about that first meeting?" Claire Hoy, remembering the afternoon she had tried to make him feel small. "Why didn't you get angry when I threatened to fire you? You could have destroyed my credibility in 10 seconds with your resume." "Because I knew what you were looking at," David replied quietly. "You were looking at a man in a blue uniform who was a threat to your schedule. I was looking at a leader who was terrified of losing her father's legacy. I didn't see the CEO. I saw the fear of falling. And you can't get angry at fear, Claire. You can only help it find a way to land safely." Emma was waiting for them at the end of the parking lot, sitting on the trunk of David's old truck, swinging her legs. She ran up to David and hugged him, her bright backpack bouncing against his side. "Did the planes fly straight today, Dad?" she asked, looking up at him with those hazel eyes. David laughed, lifting her up and swinging her around. "Yes, pal. They flew perfectly. We made sure they had the right coordinates to find their way home." Claire watched them walk away toward their home. She realized that David was right. There are always 2 sides to every flight, and 2 sides to every leader. There is the side the world sees, the power, the speed, the altitude, and then there is the side that actually matters, the side that stays when the engines stop and the lights go out. She turned and looked back at the hangar. For the first time in her life, it didn't look like a fortress built to keep the world out. It looked like a home. The story of the single dad and the CEO wasn't a romance of the heart, but a romance of the truth. It was the story of how one answer, given at the right time by the right person, could change the view for everyone. Claire Bennett drove home that night, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in the light. She was finally grounded. If you believe that real experience doesn't need to shout, it shows up when it matters most. Subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments, have you ever surprised people with what you knew just by being the quietest person in the room?